Hello guys, welcome back. If you are new here, please hit that subscribe button. On the screen I have the code or the project, basically the code that we did in the previous video. So if you haven't checked them, I would recommend that you go and check them because you don't want to get lost. So in this video, we're going to basically implement two key functions, the login function and then the register function, right? So without wasting any of your time, so let's get started. So basically we're going to implement the login function and the register function, right? So normally I want to have my logic in the controller, so I'll create a file here called user controller.ts, and we're also going to, I think we need to get rid of this. We no longer need it, or actually let me just rename it, call it user routes, and sorry, and then you are at the users routes and go into the ts file here and actually call it what it is, users routes. So, and we might also here we're going to need to use users. We are no longer going into to do's. Let me just leave it. So let's set up our routes, and we'll then focus on the logic, the login and the register, right? So but then I also like to separate the user routes with actually like the login and register. So I like to have all the routes in here will be actually like everything to do with the user except login and register. So I'm going to create a different file here in auth routes, and then this is essentially going to contain the login and the login and the register. So I can copy this in here. I can copy the code in here and put it in here. So in the auth routes, we're going to have two routes. So we're going to have the login. I need to remove this. And in the login, we're going to have the logic for logging in here. And I'm going to have another one here for register, and I'm going to have the logic for register in here. But then we cannot necessarily like let's separate what this file stands for. The file is for auth routes, so this is basically, it has to contain everything to do with routes. But then the logic for logging in, we're going to put it in here. So here I'm gonna have a function called user register user, actually register user, and of course we don't have that function or so far login user, and then so we need to create these two functions. Let me remove this. So let me save this and come in here and create two functions. So I'm going to export it, login user. This login function, or actually every function in here, will have the request object, the response, and the next function. So ours here is a request, a response, and we're also going to use this next function, which basically takes us to the next middleware, right? Oh, essentially from Express. So this is the login function, and also the register will have the same signature like this. So we have the login, we have the register, and then now that we have the export keyword here, so it means we can actually import them in here. Okay, so now we actually need to use this auth routes in the index file. I'm actually going to remove this one because we won't need auth the users routes in this video. So I'm going to have an auth routes here and actually take it and put it here, and we're gonna have an auth here. So if you go to our application /forward auth /forward login, it will actually take you to the login page or the login route, and then if you go to register, it will take you to the register, right? So this is basically what it means. So, and then now that we have these two functions, so it means we can go ahead and actually start implementing them. And let me save this. So let's go into our user route, user controller, and actually start implementing. Let's actually start with the register function. So when you register, remember our user model here, where is it? Our user model here requires the name, email, password. Active shouldn't actually be, it doesn't necessarily need to be required, and we can say by default this value is going to be true, and we also need the password, which is required. So yeah, this is what we have. We need the name, we need the email, and then we need the password. So in here, so we are expecting the user when they are registering to pass in the name, the login, the name, the email, and the password. So we can extract that information from the request body, right? Because they will be attached on the request body. We can actually, let me have a try catch block here. So we're going to extract the email, password, and name from the request body. And then in here, actually I'm just going to say next error. So what this will mean, what this actually means, is just say go to the next middleware, and then the next middleware is gonna be our error handler or our error middleware, which we implemented in the previous video here. So we just pass in that error and say go to the middleware, the error middleware, and then everything will be handled for us. So now we have extracted the email and password and name. With TypeScript, if these values are not provided, it's gonna be an error, so it will actually come in here. So, and then it's going to respond to the user about the error. So we have the email and password. So before you actually register the user, you need to know if they have already registered, right? You need to make sure that this user does not exist, and we can ensure that with this. Let's say user await, and since we're using await key now, it means we need to use the async and say users. Actually, I'm going to change something again. Instead of using users like this, I'm gonna use with the capital letter U. So users dot find one. So we're trying to find if there's a user that has an email of this one that was passed in by this user currently trying to register, right? Why there is an error here? Okay, so if we can find this user with this specified email, so it means there is going to be an error if this user, because if the user does not exist, so this will be null. But if the user exists, we're going to respond to the user and say we're going to say let's say 401 and say user already exists. So you cannot register another user with the same email. So if that user does not exist, So it means we can carry on in here. So what do we need to do now? We need to hash the password, because you don't want to save a plain text or a plain password on your database. So what we need now is actually to ensure that this password is hashed before we actually save it on our database, right? So in order for us to hash the password, we're going to need to install something. I'm also going to install a JSON web token, but we're not going to use it so far. But then now we need the library that will help us to hash our password, called it's called bcrypt. So we are installing the JSON web token and a bcrypt library, right? So let's give them a few minutes and they should be done. Okay, we are done installing them. I also need to install their types, right? And then as dev dependency, so a types for bcrypt, and types for JSON web token, and also give them a few minutes or seconds. So we are done installing JSON web token and the bcrypt and also their types, so we can go ahead and actually use them, right? So we have an error in here. What's the problem? Or users. So I'm going to delete this, and we're no longer gonna need this. So that now that we install those things, let's go ahead and use bcrypt. So with bcrypt, you need to generate a sold. Let's import it here. We no longer need this. Import bcrypt from. So we can go ahead and use bcrypt here, and there's a function called generate sold, and the sold is going to be of length 10, right? And to hash the password, we're going to say hashed password await, using the same library bcrypt. What's the function name? The function name is called hash. So the hash function takes two things. It takes in the data that you want to hash, and also the sold. So the sold is the one we generated here. So what is it that we want to hash? Is the password here. So here's the password that we want to hash, and here's our sold. So now it means we have a hashed password. What's the problem? Nah, we provided it, and then so it means we have hashed our password. So now we can go ahead and try to save this user, right? How are we going to do that? Let's say new user, await, and go to users and create. So we know that in order to create, we need to have a name, which is here, and we can also pass in the email, and then the password, we're going to pass in the hashed password, which is this one. Copy and paste. Also, we can also do this and say if there's no new user, so it means there was an error creating a new user, and then we can throw a new error here and say what's the problem. Let's say also maybe 400, and say failed to create a new user. Try again. So if the user was created, so we're going to need to create a JSON web token for them, and send them back and send it back to the client, right? And then that token will be used for every request they make to our protected routes. So we're gonna use that token to authenticate them, right? So we can simply have that function to create a JSON token in here and say, let me just call it JWT, and let's have a function that will basically do that for us. JWT, let me say, from JSON web token. And let's say have a function that will actually assign a user a token, assign token. And then in order to create a token for a user, you need to have sort of like a payload. You're gonna have to put in some information in that token so that when they come back, you can grab that information from the token and use it to authenticate. So basically this token will mask the data that you want to use when this user wants to access certain protected routes, right? So you could simply have their ID inside this token, and then when they make a request, you grab that ID, and then you grab that ID, and then you can simply check if that ID exists on your database. If it does exist, it will mean this user is authenticated, or this user is a legit user, right? I hope that makes sense. And then so we can have a payload here, or an ID. So the payload is going to be an ID, and then we can simply say it's of type any. What we're going to do is we're going to return the token. So JSON, we're going to return the token dot sign. So this function takes in two things. It takes in the payload, which is this one, and then secondly it takes in a private key, a private or a secret key. So this key essentially is what this JSON web token will create this library will create a token for us using the payload and also the key in here. So this key here, it has to be very, very unique, and normally you'd want to have that value in your .env file. So we're going to say process.env and JWT or payload secret. What are they calling it? Secret key. So this is our, actually let me be specific, that is JWT secret key. And since we don't have this, we can simply go into our env file and create a unique key. So our key is just going to be something like this. You can simply also create something unique. You don't necessarily need to create something like this. You save this, go back in here, and a string, and also to access this. So, and then let me export this. Export assign token, and we can also have a function in here to constant verify token. But then we're gonna implement it later because now we don't need it, so I'm just gonna leave it like this. So go back in here and say, so we're going to create the token here. So let me go through it again. We grab the values from the request object. We try to check if the user does not exist, because you don't want to register a user with an email that already exists on your database. So if you find that there's a user with a similar email, we throw an error, say the user already exists, And then if the user does not exist, we create a hash password. We create a hash password for this user, for this new user, and then we create this user, right? So basically we are adding this user to the database, and if the user was not created, so we'd assume this new user would be null. So we're gonna say we failed to create a new user, or failed to register a new user. And then if we did not fail, so now we need to send back to the user a token that they will use to authenticate themselves whenever they want to make a request to our protected routes, right? So now we have a constant. So what do we need to do? We need to get the token. So constant token, and we can call that function assign token, and then it needs a payload, right? A payload is gonna be our ID. So how do we get the ID? We can say new user dot no new user dot ID. So they're gonna create, or this function will create a token, and our payload is gonna be the ID of this newly created user, right? And now we can actually respond to the user and say status and 201 for created, and we say message okay, user is successfully registered, we can pass in the code, which is going to be 201. The data here. So what is it that we want to send back to the user? We want to send back this token. So this token, the user will be able to use it to authenticate themselves for every request they make to our protected routes. So we have written all this without actually testing. I'm going to need to run this and actually see how our login works, our login function works. npm run dev, and yeah, so this is basically the login function. Wait, not the login, the register function. Yeah, this is the register function. Actually, I think we need to do something. I just remember that we missed something. Think about it this way, right? So if we don't provide the email, password, or name, so this line here will throw an exception. What is this? This says there is already something running on 3000. Okay, I'll fix this, but then for now I was actually explaining that if the email, password, or name, or either any of them is not provided, this line here will throw an exception and say we are trying to extract or distract something that does not exist, right? So in order to do a better validation, let's do this. Let's have constant email, and here we're going to actually have the email. Here we're gonna have the password, and we need the name and password, right? So if any of these three is not provided, we're going to throw an error. Email. So we're gonna throw our error here, new error, throw an error 400 and say user provided invalid details. All right, so let me save, should run. And then, as I've explained in the first video, that we'll be building and testing with Postman. So once it's run, so I'm gonna open Postman. Let me wait for it to say database is connected. Okay, here we go. We are connected to the database. Go to Postman and let's create a folder here. So inside this folder, everything to do with user, right? Everything to do with user is gonna be in here. And add the request, not a get, but a post the request to localhost 3000 auth and register, right? For now, let's just test and send a request and see if we are getting any error. A user provided invalid details, so you can see that we did not provide anything. And also I would like us to wait, why are we getting a so we are basically consoling log. Okay, I think in here in the error middleware, in order for you to be able to test or see the errors, so you need to have this console log. So add this console log, so whenever there is an error, you can be able to see it in your terminal. And also in the index, you also need to provide that it says user provided invalid details. So wait a minute. Let's do this. Go to row and let's add the information that we need to pass in. It's gonna be an email, our email at gmail.com. We're gonna have a password. Password is gonna be password, and we also need the name, which should be a string, our first name. Let's send. It still says user provided invalid details because in here in the index file you need to tell this application, our application here, that it should expect or it should accept JSON data when we send to it. Let's wait again. So with this function here, JSON, or what we do is whatever data we send to the user, we send to our server, our API is gonna pass it into a JSON, right? So we can be able to access it through our dot request dot body object. So yeah, that's what this basically does. Now we are connected to the database. Let's hit send. So boom, we have managed to create a user. So a user is successfully registered, code 2014 for created, and then this is our token. So if you want to validate the user, you'd want to have this token saved somewhere on your client side, and then every time the user or the client wants to access protected routes, we're going to use this token to ensure that this user is indeed our user, right? So far we have a login function, and then not a login function, a register function. So we can go ahead and implement the login function. So this is basically our register function. Our login function is going to have similar logic. I'm going to create this, copy this and paste here. We don't need the name. I'm going to say email or password is incorrect. Let me say it's incorrect. And so now we need to find if indeed the user exists, right, using this email. And then we can still copy that line from here. So instead of having to check if the user exists, so we're gonna say if the user does not exist. So if we don't find this email, so if we don't find a user with this email, we're going to say a user does not exist, right? Why do I have this for one? So we're gonna say a user does not exist. So if the user indeed exists, if indeed the user exists, so we need to check now we need to check if the password now they have provided indeed matches the one that we have saved on our database. And again, let's go to our database and check the user that we registered. So if we refresh this, we should be able to see, oh, there's 4. We should be able to see the one that we just did. So our first name, so there's a problem here. So our first name and the email, and then we also have a password here. You can see our password is hashed. You can see it's not the plain password that we provided in Postman. We hashed it before we saved it. And then since by default we said active, the active flag is going to be true. So now we need to grab this user by the email and compare the password and see if the hashed password matches the one that was provided. So now we're going to say, okay, now this user indeed exists. So we need to compare the password that was found, which is hashed, and then the one that was provided, which is not hashed. So what we're going to do is say compare emails or compare passwords, right? Or passwords match await bcrypt dot compare. There's a function called compare which takes in 2 things. It takes in the data, which is our password in this case, and secondly takes in the encrypted or the hashed password. How do we get it? We're going to say user dot password. So this user is the one we get from the server. So user dot password is this. So if these passwords match, this will be true. If they do not match, it's going to be false. So in case there is false, then it means the user provided the right email, but then the password was not right. We're going to say email or password. Email and password did not match. Email or password did not match our records, right? So this means the user was indeed correct with the password or the email. I mean, the email was right, but then the password provided was not right. So we say, what's going on? Or we did not pass in the code. So if indeed this password match, so we need to respond the user to the user status, which should be okay, and that is 200, and send back to the user. What are we sending back to the user? Oh, before we actually send back to the user, we need to create, what's this problem? But then there it is. It should catch up. So once the user is created, we need to create a new token, right? So let's say user constant token, and we have a function called assign token here. Where is it? Similar, we're actually going to have this line or this block of code. Paste this here, and going to say user is now logged in 200, and we're not going to say new user, we're going to say user because here's the user. And I would like us to move everything in here into a try catch block, right? So let me copy cut, and in here we're simply going to do the same thing. So boom, like this, we have implemented our login function. I hope it works. So we check if the user is trying to log in, but then ensure that they provided the email and password. So and now we check the user if the email exists on our database. So if that email does not exist on our database, it means the user does not exist. And if the email indeed exists on our database, now we need to ensure that the password that was hashed and saved on our database matches the current one that was provided. And this password is going to be a plain text, right, or a plain password. So we take the plain password and then the hash password, and we let bcrypt to compare them. If these passwords indeed match, if they do not match, actually we're going to respond and say this password, they do not match, the password and the email do not match. If they match, it means this user can now proceed and log in into our system or our project, right? And then we create a new token and we pass in that token back to the user or the client, and then the client, they can save it somewhere so that every time the user makes a request, they can be able to use that token. So let's go to our Postman and go into login. So now we are testing the login. So with the login, we no longer need the name. Our password was password, right? Our password was password. Let me change the email here. Send. The user does not exist because this email does not exist, right? So let's provide an email that exists but then with the wrong password. Email or password do not match our records. Yeah, that's basically it. We know, wait a minute, I should actually make this a post request and this should be a login. Let me save it. Yeah, so when a password that exists but then the password does not exist, we're gonna say user email or password do not match our record. So now let me provide a correct email and a correct password and see if the user is gonna be logged in. So the user is logged in, and then we can grab the token and save it somewhere, right? And save it in our client side. Actually, let me do this as a token and also pass it here so that, yes. So yeah, essentially everything works. We now are able to register and to log in. So in the next video, we'll be building an authentication middleware. So every time the user makes a request, we're going to grab that token that they sent to us and verify it and see if we allow them to move or to actually access the protected routes, right? So yeah, because with login and register, you do not need to have that token because these routes are not protected. So in order for us to move to protected routes, we are actually going to implement the auth middleware function first, and then we actually going to start with pretty much every logic that we need. So now we are connected. What did we do? What did I change? Oh, I changed how we access the token. Yes, the token is here, and then here's the token. So you need to save this token somewhere, and every time you make a request to our user or our application or our project, we're going to take this token and verify if indeed you are the right user. Yeah, thank you guys. So this is pretty much the end of it. Let's see each other in the next video. Thank you. Please don't leave without hitting that subscribe button.